Let's talk about it.
Hello and welcome back to Thicc Radio, the award-winning podcast where we talk about gaming, fetishism, and everything plus size. I'm James.
And I'm Tim, so let's get into it. Today we're welcoming to the show Luna.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Of course. Luna, my love, how are you today?
I'm good. I've got a little cold, so I might be a little nasally, but other than that, I'm pretty good this morning.
Oh, bless you. Well, you know what? It is the cold months now. This does happen when you're trying to sit there and sound, tonally nice, and then a little something comes along and knocks us for six. But to us, you sound lovely. And I'm sure the listeners are just going to be gorgeously grateful to hear your lovely voice regardless today. So, Luna, my love, are you ready to get into the conversation?
I am, thank you.
Fabulous. Well, listen, first things first, who is Luna Westish? What do you want our listeners to know about you?
So I'm an author. I recently published my first book, Meet Me at the Ruins, in June of this year. And this is my first novel, my first publication. And so I've been learning a lot the last few months about publication and about marketing. I'm actually a social media marketing professional, IRL, but book marketing is a whole different thing. And so I do a lot of different things. I teach business to kids. I do social media marketing. But right now I have this mantle of author that I'm trying on, seeing how it fits. And so that's me.
Listen, I think that's pretty fabulous. I would like to publish a book myself at some point in the future. So I may very well hit you up at some time and just be like, Luna, babes, got a couple of questions, need a little guidance.
And by a couple of questions, you will have like several thousand. Like, it's complicated. It's not an easy feat. No matter which direction you go, it is complicated and there are so many different steps to it. So yes, please hit me up.
I mean, even the cursory looking, it's like, oh, there's obviously the writing part, and then you've got to do some amount of editing to it, and then you have to package it in a way that it looks fine enough as it is, write letters to all of the different publishers who might want to take a look at it and try to sell it to them, and then whether or not they agree, there's a back and forth, and then if they do agree, there's like another 2 years of like back and forth thing with like, let's change a word here, or let's think about the stuff, and like, it sounds like so much. My God.
You really have to be incredibly patient. The querying process on its own for most people takes years. So even if you have an amazing book, you have to, like you said, package it in such a way that in one, like even half of a page, they're so excited about it that they want to read the entire thing. And by the entire book, they want to represent you or they want to publish it, depending on whether you're querying agents or whether you're querying publishing houses. But that part, the like smushing everything down into a half a page and making it sound really perfect and having a professional blurb before you've ever published a book before, I think that's the hardest part of all of it, is figuring out how to query and what people respond to, and actually also who to query. And Query Tracker, I'm going to throw a shout out to Query Tracker, is a website where you can do all of this in one place, and they have like a free version, and then they have a professional version that's only like $40 a year. Like, it's very reasonable, and you can track all of the queries that you've submitted, but you can also submit a lot of the queries through the website itself, and then track like who's asked for the full manuscript and who's asked to have a conversation with you and things like that. And that actually does make it a lot easier, but like, it's still not easy. It's still incredibly complicated. But I love that you can look for different agents or publishers that look for specific genres. So if you write romance, then there will be specific people who you should talk to about that. Or if you write contemporary fiction. And so that was really interesting for me and a really good learning experience.
Oh, certainly sounds it. And listen, I think as part of the conversation today, we can dig a little into what that process is like, what some of those experiences are like. But I think let's take it all the way back. So you say this is your first book. What inspired you to want to write in the first place?
I've never been much of a fiction writer. I've always written nonfiction. So I used to do environmental reports, and then I've written a lot of essays about my childhood and my experience on gender and queerness and things like that. But I've never really written fiction before. And about 3 years ago, my, at the time, 11-year-old was like, I want to write a book. Well, can we set aside time every week to go to a coffee shop and write? And I was like, of course, like that sounds really cool. And after a couple of weeks, I was like, oh, I have a book forming. Like, this is really cool. Like, I definitely thought that this was just going to be like a little thing where I was just going to poke around on the computer, for a couple of hours a week. But something was really coming together. And it was like, it was all there inside of me already. I just hadn't had any conscious thoughts about this book. But it was like, it almost wrote itself. Like, it was all there to begin with. And even the arcs that I thought that I wanted for the characters, like, changed themselves as I was writing them. And so after like maybe 2 months of writing, I started putting the book on Kindle Vella, which doesn't exist anymore, but at the time was a way that you could actually earn money, like by writing. And I made like several $100s on the book before it was even like halfway written. It was really
Damn.
cool, like to actually make money. When it was funny because my husband had published the book later, and at one like a year earlier, and at one point I had actually made more writing my book, like in process, than he had already made publishing it, because it's just really, really hard to make money from books. And so that was affirming in a way. Like, I'm not even sure that I would have finished it had I not had that like affirmation of like, people enjoy reading this. And so the flip side of that is that because I published it on Kindle Vella, no traditional publisher would touch it. So like, I completely knocked myself out of like of a traditional publishing contract, because they will not touch anything where like even the first chapter has been published online, which I didn't know at the time. And I'm actually glad I didn't know it, because I think I would have approached things a lot differently had I known that. And I do feel like I needed that initial feedback that I was getting from Kindle Vella, and also the community that I was getting out of it. And so I think I had about half of it published on Kindle Vella, and then I was really started diving more into publication requirements. And a lot of traditional publishers, if they're even going to look at your book, it has to have been off Kindle Vella for like a certain amount of months. So I decided I'm not going to finish this up on Kindle Vella. I'm just going to pull it off so that I can start querying. And I finished it a few months later, and then spent like a year editing it and like putting it down for a couple months, and then coming back and editing it again, like with basically fresh eyes, because I have a terrible memory. So I'd be like, oh, I forgot that happened. And then from the time when I actually decided like, I'm going to publish this, it was about 3 months of formatting, figuring out all the platforms that I wanted to use, which I had the benefit of having already helped my husband doing this. So it wasn't like starting from scratch for me, although it's still just as hard the second time you do it, honestly. And then I published it in June. I self-published, which is kind of a whole other story. We can get into that now. We can get into that later. But I ended up choosing to self-publish in part because of some of those timeline things that you talked about. Like, I'm not a very patient person. And even though it took me about 2.5 to 3 years to actually publish the book, the idea of waiting 2 additional years like past that was very unattractive to me.
Now, you describe yourself as fat, disabled, non-binary, queer, and femme author, and ex-cult survivor. How many of these identities have informed your writing, particularly when writing your main character in the story, Margot?
I think to some extent, all of them do, right? So like, even though I did not start with the intention of writing Margot as this like anxious person who really doesn't feel super comfortable in her own skin, it showed up like by the end of chapter 1. It was just there. It was primed. It was ready to go. So that was really interesting to me, because I had this vision of sort of who she was and how she was going to be. And instead, a lot of my lived experience sort of came through in her, because I think that to some extent, we write what we know. And at the same time, like, there are definitely people who don't do that. They write fantasy, and that's amazing. I can't imagine being like a fantasy writer. I think that's so cool. But for me, I write what I know. And so a lot of her experiences, and a lot of the experiences for other characters in the book as well, were at least to some extent infused with like real things that have happened to me, or real thoughts that I've had. And it was so interesting, like just how quickly it ramped up to her being like a very anxious person, which is something that I've dealt with basically my whole life. But she also has some sort of, I think, other like undiagnosed neurodivergencies, which is actually kind of one of the themes of the book. This is set back in the early 2000s, when we were not having very thoughtful conversations about mental health and neurodivergence. And so a lot of the book is her feeling really isolated from other people, because she doesn't have the language to talk about mental health issues. She doesn't have the language to talk about how she's feeling, she doesn't feel like other people would understand. And the couple of times that she does try to talk to people about it, they're kind of like, what are you talking about? Like, no, I've never had those thoughts. And so that can feel very isolating. And that was true to my experience with mental health. And I would say like high school and college in particular, before I started meeting people who were like going to therapy and taking antidepressants, or like actually working on themselves, because like that didn't exist in my sphere until I was sort of in my mid-20s, was the concept of like, you have to like take what you're given and work with it, but also like work on it. And I think the sort of environment that I was raised in was like, you have to be perfect all the time. And those two things are incompatible. Being perfect and like acknowledging the challenges that you have and working on them are not particularly compatible. And so that was obvious for me as a child, a really, really challenging situation to be in, but it was really freeing once I found people who were willing to talk about those kinds of things. And it was actually my first therapy experience was because I was sexually harassed at work, and my work paid for me to go see a counselor. And the counselor was like, okay, let's talk about the sexual harassment and how it's affecting you, but also you have massive undiagnosed anxiety and you're also really depressed. And I was like, oh, this might explain a lot of what's going on with me right now as a young adult. And I was having like panic attacks at the mall and things like that, but I didn't know what they were. I had literally had no words for them. I didn't know anybody who had panic attacks. So a lot of that lived experience of being an anxious person, having mental health challenges, even like having rituals and coping mechanisms. Like in the book, Margot's a runner. She runs as a coping mechanism to sort of quiet her mind. A lot of those things come from my lived experience. And I would say even like the fact that I am disabled, which is a label that I have been very reluctant to use in the past, but I'm really working on claiming it in a positive way, that in a way to like create boundaries for myself and be able to explain myself a little bit better, because I started working when I was 13, and I basically worked like straight through until I had kids about 14 years ago. And then even then as a mom, you're expected to work like literally 24 hours a day. And being able to take on that label of disabled and be able to explain to people like, I can't do all these things that you're expecting me to do. Like, let's pull it back. Let's figure out what I actually need to do, or what also serves me and you. I think that there's elements of that in the book too, right? And there's also an interesting crossover between like, where does mental health and anxiety, or maybe ADHD or OCD or autism, there's a Venn diagram of those issues and also disability, but it's not a circle. And so for me, that nuance has been really challenging for me to figure out, like, at what point do you call yourself disabled? Because I can do some work and I do work, but I can't do, like, I couldn't go to an office, for 40 hours a week and sit in a chair. That would be really, really hard on my body, and I wouldn't last very long. And so that nuance of like, what do we call ourselves, and how do those labels impact our own internal monologue, and how do they affect how other people see us? And also, when you have invisible disabilities, how does that impact you and the world around you? All of that comes up in the story in multiple different ways.
And when you reflect on this long journey that you've had of like self-identity, or I mean self-discovery rather, seeking out therapy and then writing this book, how has that shifted your sense of self?
I think my sense of self has changed enormously over time. I was raised in a cult and left it at around 22 years old. When I left, I didn't know I was leaving a cult. I thought I was just leaving like the church of my family, like that my family was involved in. And it wasn't actually until about 5 years ago that I learned that it was a cult, and it sort of blew me wide open. Like it really changed so many things for me and allowed me to start really digging into some challenging thought patterns that I have, for like even like homophobic stuff that just is still so deep in my psyche because it was how I was raised, or fat phobia, right? Because fat people aren't perfect, and just all these little things, really having to just undo them, or really work to undo them one by one, because I will be the first to acknowledge there's no like done when you're talking about undoing those kinds of things. It's just how much can you do at any point in time, and that fluctuates. That sense of like, do I have the capacity to deal with my trauma right now, changes for me over time. And so when I first learned that this was a cult, I did so much research and really dove in and wrote a lot. And then there was like a period of a year where I didn't really write it much. I didn't really think about it all that much. And then something happens, and then I'm like right back in doing interviews or podcasts, or doing my own research and writing more. And so that experience has, to some extent, really hamstrung me understanding who I am, because it took so long for me to understand that these things that underpin who I was, that I thought maybe were just like who I was or my personality, turns out like most of it came from the cult. And I had thought, oh well, my hard work comes from my dad, like just really, constantly like hammering us that hard work was so important. But then the more that I did research, I was like, oh, this actually comes from cult teachings. So like the perfectionism, the hard work, the insistence on like family and God being like the most important things, that all came from the cult. So all these things that I had been raised with that I thought were like family attributes were actually just cult teachings. And so then you have to say, what of this am I actually? And that was really hard. And that's been a really hard undoing process for me. And I'm not nearly done. Like I just started 5 years ago, right? And actually one of the things for me that had really helped was I actually started seeing a food therapist, because there was so much in the cult about food and like eating healthy and like maintaining your body as a temple and being skinny, and how like important all of those things were, like being pretty. Like one time I shaved my head in high school, and my mom was like appalled because I had I like a woman's hair is her crowning glory, right? So like all these things about your image and about your body, that actually seeing a food therapist was one of the things that helped me the most to really realize that like it sounds really sad, but like there's very little of me that's genuinely me. There's so much of me that comes straight from these cult teachings. And so then I have to say, what of this is actually me, and who am I, and what do I want out of life? And that's been a really interesting sort of parallel process to my understanding of my gender and queerness, because until 5 years ago, I didn't have any language about what had happened to me because I didn't know that I had been in a cult. And in the same way, until maybe like 5 to 8 years ago, I didn't really have any examples of non-binary people who were still somewhat femme, or non-binary people who called themselves a mother, or non-binary people who were not interested in transitioning fully to a different gender. The back like maybe, I don't know, 8 years ago, it was like you were, what was it called? Like agender, or like androgynous, or what was the other one? Like where something in between. And I'm like, I don't feel like I'm something in between. So it's been really interesting as I've sort of had to piece together who I actually am, that like that my gender and my queerness have come along with that, because I was raised in this very homophobic, very racist environment, very fat phobic, anti-Semitic, just all the things, all the
Yeah.
awful things.
And you're not alone in that. There are millions of people who are unpacking generational trauma. They may not have
Mm.
necessarily been raised in a religious cult, but I think that even if most adults won't admit to it, that a lot of us feel like Frankenstein monsters of, just stitched together bits and pieces of what we learned in school, what we learned from our parents, our grandparents, just people that were around us in general. And you're not the only one who's dealing with a lot of like shit coming up from their past, and it's sad that we have to go through this. I'm going to assume you're probably a millennial like us. Like we were sort of the generation that began to question all of this stuff for the first time. And so we were kind of the guinea pigs. We're kind of the first ones that were like, oh shit, these spoiled brats are now questioning everything about life. What are we going to do? Like,
Mhm. It's very interesting because I feel like I don't have a relationship with my parents anymore, mostly because I left the cult, but then it like sort of doubled down when I started to write about my experiences of child abuse and religious trauma. But their position is like, we can do anything we want to you, and you don't have any like consent or say in this. And it's so fascinating to me that like me saying out loud, like, I think you should treat me well is a problem. Like, and I just have
Mm.
so many friends who are in this position of just like begging their parents, like, could you please just be a little nicer to me? Like, could you please be nicer to your community? Like, could you please just like exist in a world where we take care of each other? And that those things are so seen as so selfish and so radical. I have been called selfish by so many of my family members so many times for drawing a boundary, like, no, I'm not going to go to church with you. Like, how, like, yes, that's selfish. That's the whole fucking point. Like, I am taking care of myself for the first time in my adult life, and I don't want more religious trauma on top of that. Thank you very much. So if that's what selfish
Mm.
is, call me selfish. Do you know what I mean? Like, I will
Yes.
take that on if that's what that means. If it means learning how to be a better person and how to not be such an asshole to everybody all the time in the service of God. And yeah, I'll be selfish.
You know, if you're taking the
It-
time
yeah.
to look after yourself, be a better person, all this, and someone say, "Oh, well, you're a bad person because you're actually focusing on being better," then you're like, "So be it." Like if anyone brands you as a bad person that way, that's not somebody you want to talk to in the first place.
And you know what? Like this is all a part of like societal gaslighting because and let's think about this, right? The way in which typically women are also being framed. They are called bossy. They're never allowed to be leaders. Girls are chatterboxes. They're not communicators. Girls are, and it's all the ways in which society tries to get us in our own heads about who and what we are to stop us from operating in our fullness. Because if we were to operate in our fullness, like we'd be unstoppable. And I think about this also through the lens of fatness, the way in which, the claims against fat people who are just like, I just want to like myself and not like want to die. And then the people who are like, you're literally trying to make everyone commit suicide with obesity, and you're just like, this is wild. Let the fat bitches be fat and happy. Like, why is that such a trick? Because then they don't have control over you and they don't like not having control over you. And so I sense such this power from you, this person you are, this person that you're uncovering and unpacking, this journey you're going on. And it's just delightful to get to bear witness to a lot of this with you. And something I'd like to ask you about here, as this person with neurodivergence that you're unpacking, and now you're a parent yourself, and you've got all of your own stuff that's going on. Where the fuck do you find the creativity, the productivity, the balance, the energy in your day-to-day life? Baby, where are you pulling all of this from?
Well, I have to admit, there's an enormous, like, heaping tablespoon of privilege in there because my husband and I have been extremely frugal our whole, like, we've been together, I think, like 22 years or something, like, for forever. And we have been very frugal that whole time. We make really good financial decisions. We paid off all our student loans really early. But at the same time, like, I was thinking about this the other day. I've never been in a position where I had to like take care of a sick parent for years on end, or been in a position where I couldn't work at all for years on end. So there's a lot of privilege in there that allows me to actually work part-time on my, like, on the things that actually make me money. And that doesn't mean that I'm not actually working full-time. I probably do work full-time between like writing and both of my kids are homeschooled, and so I'm involved. Not, I don't like literally teach them, but and I'm involved in a lot of the things that they do, and getting them to classes and things like that. But if I had to work a 40-hour a week where I came home at the end of that week or at the end of that day absolutely exhausted, I probably wouldn't have the creativity to write. So this is all kind of wrapped in this very tangled like ball of rubber bands, right? Where like if I was a non-disabled person, I would still be working that 40-hour week and I probably wouldn't have a lot of creativity. But sort of forcing myself to understand that I can't work a traditional 40-hour week has actually allowed some of that creativity to come back in. So sort of claiming that label of disabled and just being honest about myself and about my physical limitations and my chronic illness, and not just trying to mask that all the time and then like go home and cry at night, has allowed me to create space in my life for, I like to say, being bad at things. Like I was raised in an environment where I had to be really good at everything. And it's been this real unlearning process of like, I'm really bad at watercolor painting. I will never get better. Like, I don't know what it is. I'm actually like pretty good at art and stuff. Watercolor, I suck at it, but I still enjoy it. And so it's like, what can we do that we enjoy for no purpose of like monetization or proving yourself to anybody, just for like the enjoyment of it? And I kind of think of reading as the same way. Reading is the one thing that's just like so personal to us. We don't have to prove it to anybody. You don't have to prove to anybody that you read a book or that you understood it. Like actually that's one of the reasons I don't really do book clubs because I'm like, I don't care if my understanding of this book was different from yours. Like this was uniquely my experience here. And so I find like a lot of comfort in reading in that way, but I've had to really create that space. And part of that as well has been just acknowledging that some of the things that I like to do are never going to make me money, including this book. Like if this book blows up and I sell like 1 million copies, obviously that would be amazing. But at the same time, you can't go into self-publishing or even like a small publisher and expect to make even like 5 grand from your first book. Like it's just not, that's not realistic. And so I kind of knew that already. from my husband's book, although his book has actually been really successful in the context of it being like nonfiction, wonky. He's sold like a lot of books for that sphere, but I knew how hard it was to get there. And so part of this has been letting go of like the need to match other people's financial freak. Like everyone else is like, I need to work full time, I need to make this much money, I need to do these things, I need to have a car, I need to have this big house, etc. And I've had to undo a lot of that and be like, what do I actually need out of life? We don't have a car. We live in a walkable city. We are extremely frugal. Like we don't go out and drink. We maybe eat out as a family like once or twice a week. But then we go on like these big vacations because that's what's really important to us is travel. And so I've had to really over, even when I was in college, it was the same way. Everyone was going out and drinking. And I was like, I'm saving my money because I want to go somewhere for spring break. And by somewhere, I don't mean Panama City. I mean like London. And so I've had to undo a lot of those financial tropes really about like what we should expect out of life. On top of all of that, I've had to figure out when am I actually productive and when am I creative? And this has actually shifted for me over time. But for the most part, I feel most creative and most productive in the mornings. But I'm not creative and productive at home. So I literally have to like pack all my stuff up, go to a coffee shop and sit there for 4 or 5 hours. And I can write more in those 4 or 5 hours or get more like administrative work done for my businesses than I could in an entire week sitting at home at my dining room table. So a lot of what I would say it comes down to like creativity and finding time for creativity is really just like radical honesty with yourself. Like, does it matter whether you're going to make money from this?
I think there's so much gold there that can be unpacked, and I'm going to do our best to try and get to as much of that as we can. I want to circle back a little because you had mentioned that something that's very important to you and your family is travel, and I believe you're quite the storied traveler. Looking it up online, you've been to loads of places, and you seem to have this real draw to travel. And I'd like to ask, what is it that you've gleaned from travel that's inspired you and your writing the most?
I think I was thinking about this in the context of travel and why I still, I think I started traveling internationally when I was like 16. I went to Peru for a like class trip, which was amazing and really life-changing in a lot of ways. And then I really prioritized my whole adult life. I've prioritized travel over pretty much anything else, over like things, clothes, booze, whatever. Like travel was always more important to me. And I think to some extent, I certainly, I wouldn't generalize this to everybody, but I couldn't know myself until I had done more traveling. I grew up in Vermont. Vermont's a really small place. I grew up in a suburban area. Had I just stayed, I think it would have been incredibly difficult to figure out who I was outside of the context of what the expectations were for me at that time. I ended up going to college in North Carolina because I needed some space. And in retrospect, I needed that space to be able to leave the church. But at the time, I just was like, I just want some like independence because I was raised in this environment. My parents would say, you're not an adult until you're financially independent. So as a young person, I was like, I just want to be financially independent. Like that's my goal, just be financially independent. So being apart from my parents was a big part of that. And then I went to London for graduate school. And after London, moved to Florida to be with my now husband, who also is very passionate about travel, which is great because if he hadn't been, this all would have been a lot harder. But I think for me, like everywhere I go, teaches me something about people or about myself. And I think that there is a loveliness to just like growing up in one place and never traveling. And I'm sure that there are a lot of people that are very fulfilled by that. But for me, there's always been this like hole in my heart that's like, I need to fill it with new places and like beautiful mountain views and like a baguette in Paris. And it always felt like it was part of me. Like it was just part of who I was and part of who I wanted to be and part of who I felt like I could become. Like, I don't know how to explain this. It's like, I know that if I just stopped traveling, that I would also stop learning. Like not completely, but there's that facet of travel that exposes you to new people and new cultures and even new foods or new ways of thinking about like health challenges or mental health challenges. Like I was just reading about the concept of autism in the Maori language. And I was just like, this is so cool that we have, now we have social media to show us a lot of these things and introduce us to new concepts and new ideas. But back when I first started traveling in like, I guess 98, like we didn't have social media in the same way. Like, right, it was just like the very beginning days of the internet, and basically just using the internet as, you know, like a source for writing articles, like, or a source for writing reports. Like, it wasn't really, we didn't have social media in the same way to give us information. So I feel like I'm my most myself when I'm traveling, and I also feel like I'm more myself every time I come back.
I hope that you don't mind me asking a question about the cult, only because like this is something that I'm genuinely curious about. I've read books from people who have left cults before. I used to live in Kansas City, Missouri, and I was very aware of the Westboro Baptist Church. I saw them quite frequently. They were always out picketing things. And having read testimony from some of those members who left, you know, they said that the reason why they eventually broke away, a couple of them actually cited Twitter and
Mhm.
talking to people on Twitter. And you say that travel helped sort of push back against the things that you had been raised to believe. Did you get any pushback from your family members that were deeply entrenched in the cult still? Like, did they tell you not to travel? Did they say, oh, you know, don't listen to these people, don't listen to this, you know, like you're getting caught up in the, I can't remember how religious people tend to put this nomenclature, but something about how you get caught up in the world and you're getting caught up in other people and you're bending yourself around an axle, I think is something that
Mhm.
they say an awful lot.
Yeah, don't
So
backslide. Don't backslide. Don't fall into temptation. What was it they used to say when I was church? You know, that you'd be like, you are in the world, but you are no longer of the
not
world.
of it. Yeah.
You're not of the
So
world.
the cult that I was in is called the Way International. It was not called that by the time I left. I actually had like a an hour and a half interview with a reporter recently to talk about the cult specifically, and we talked about how by the time I left, it was a splinter group. So splinter groups are groups from cults that basically you drop down to a smaller size, and they effectively become unable to track. So a lot of splinter groups from the Way International became these like sort of home fellowships, or maintained these home fellowships, and but also maintained a lot of the power structures and abuse of the cult. So if you look up River Road Fellowship, that was an offshoot of the Way International. There have been other examples of offshoots of the Way International being abusive and in the news. But the Way International was a very strange cult because it unusually did not request that you cut off contact with family. And the reason that it didn't request that you cut off contact with family is because it relied on your family to send you money every month. So the Way International basically would like require you, if you were like committed, to spend a year or 2 or 3 years basically like living in like really crappy communal situations and having your family support you in that, and also like having your family send enough money so that you could also tie 10% of that whatever you were getting. And my parents did this. Some of my siblings did this. They did like, you know, they call them like wow years, word over the world, I think is what it was called. So the unique thing about the Way is that they actually were super into education, which is not normal for a cult. They actually had or possibly continue to have a really big presence at Bowling Green University. That a lot of the at least up until recently, a lot of the RAs were actually like part of the Way International, and they get those jobs so that they can proselytize to people, get more people, get more money. And both my parents are college educated. Both my parents are incredibly intelligent. And it really fascinating to me about that is that a lot of times, myself included, people think that people who join or stay in cults are dumb and somehow like naive and stupid and know nothing about the world. My parents were adults when they joined, and they were educated, and somehow this still called to them. And then years later, after having been abused and gaslit and traumatized, they were like, you know what would be great? Let's add some kids to this mix and let's do this to them. Like, I will never understand that. But at the same time, it's not like it was unique to my parents. Like, this is a pattern of behavior within religion, and especially high control groups all over the world. And especially in that group, like the Way International was not technically like a quiverful group, but it definitely leaned in that direction where it was like have lots of kids, because like that's how we'll kind of take over the world. And so the Way International was unique in that it prioritized education and it prioritized travel. So a lot of people who did these like wow years did them overseas. And actually, the reason I have such a fondness for Scotland is because my dad spent a lot of time there studying the Bible at this like facility that they had. So my dad talked about Scotland all the time when I was a kid. And so so this real interesting, the way international meets all of the criteria of being a cult, but at the same time, some of the things that we think of as being cult-like eschewing education or cutting you off from your family and things like that, were not part of that world. And so I think that that's why I felt so comfortable in education and so comfortable in travel, is because it was like two of the only things that aligned with who I felt like I was, and that was acceptable within the church. Like I did theater and I wanted to be an actor, and everyone was like, no, you can't do that. Like that's not allowed. So I was allowed to be in theater in college as long as it didn't affect the rest of my education. And at one point I was like, I think I want to be a photojournalist. And they were like, no, you can't do that. That doesn't serve the body of Christ, right? You can be a teacher, that's fine. Or you can be something else that's in service. So I ended up getting a master's in urban design because photojournalism wasn't Christ-like enough, and somehow urban design was okay with my parents. And so it's I think that it was just those two things were worlds that overlapped in a way that was accessible to me. And so other things like drinking and partying and things like that, I had access to them, but they didn't really align with who I felt like or who the church wanted me to be. And so travel and education were the places where I had access to them. We were very middle class through most of my childhood. So I had access to go to college, which not everybody does. And I had access to some travel and things like that. So I think for me, it was just those were my safe spaces where and also I think that there's something really unique about travel where you get to kind of reinvent yourself every time you go somewhere new. And that's actually came up a lot in the book that I wrote, because it's certainly been
Yeah.
my experience that when you don't know anybody there, you don't have to meet anybody's expectations. And for me, I think that's really freeing. For a lot of people, I think that makes them really nervous, right? But for me, that's always been part of the draw, is that I can my husband and I don't have a lot of family we can leave our kids with. So about 10 years ago or something, we were we're never going to get to go places unless we start going places separately. So my husband and I take separate vacations every year. We also do a lot of travel with the family, but we don't really do vacations. We don't sit at the beach for a week, right? So he goes to Calgary and watches hockey games. And I go to the beach and I bring 4 books, and I literally don't talk to anybody for 5 days. It's amazing. And I love it because in my normal life, I have to talk all the time. I teach, I have clients, I have kids, I have a partner, I have a dog that I talk to. And I find it so freeing to go somewhere and be a quiet person. I love that. But I also love going to a new city and just walking around and getting lost and being that person. And so for me, travel is freeing in a way where I think I can lift other people's expectations off of my shoulders when I'm traveling in a way that I find challenging to do even now in my day-to-day life.
100%. Listen, I think there's been so much good here exploring more of you and a lot of that history. I'd like to take an opportunity to dig a little bit into the book itself. So, for our listeners, the book is Meet Me at the Ruins. As we were talking about, the setting is 2003. Margot is reeling from a bad breakup, and she's looking forward to a drama-free semester abroad at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. This is when she meets Wren, her beautiful and mysterious downstairs neighbor, and her plans to keep things uncomplicated suddenly vanish. Struggling with the pace of her courses and unsure of how to nurture her new friendships, Margot's brain works overtime to make sense of her new environment. She longs for Wren, but she's unwilling to pine away while he figures out his complicated feelings. Constantly trying to rise above her anxious nature, Margot throws herself into the social and sensual opportunities that studying abroad offers. She discovers that her happiness is made up of small but significant moments. She revels in cappuccinos with fluffy foam, long runs past ancient stone buildings, museums with friends, and surprising, spicy encounters. And despite the low rumble of an existential crisis nipping at her feet, Margot is determined to find her place in the world. And even some excerpts of the book that we've had the opportunity to read through, it really resonates with me as a millennial about when you are trying to navigate that sense of who you believe yourself to be, with what you're experiencing, with what you're learning, with what you're then coming to understand, which mirrors so much of all of your life experiences that you've been sharing. And to me, that becomes so clear that that is you fully imbued into this character of Margot. And I'd like to ask you, as much as, you say that Margot is very much a reflection of who you are now, how much of Margot is you and how much of Margot is other people?
I would say Margot is like maybe 30% me. I think that I would say more of Margot's experiences are me. So things that truly happened, but I've sort of adjusted it and changed the way that it happens for the book. Though that's more me. But I do feel like I had this idea of who Margot was, and then she sort of ran away with the story. And every time I sat down, wherever I thought I was going, it went in a different direction. And I find that fascinating because I always thought you have to have like this arc and you have to say this is happening and then this and then this and this and this and then that's the end. And I had an ending in my brain the whole time. And about like 2/3 of the way through, I was like, oh, this is not going there. Like this is not going to end the way that I thought. But it actually ends in a much more realistic, honest, how life works kind of way, which is really interesting to me because I didn't really set to write out a book that felt like real life. But I think my favorite books are those ones that feel like real life, that feel like you're kind of reading and you're like, oh, I've made that dumb mistake before, or like, oh yeah, I've had that situation where I was like massively in love with somebody but like they wouldn't give me the time of day, so I go and I fool around with somebody else. I had people tell me like, you can't do that in a book. You can't like have somebody pining away for somebody and then go fool around with other people. And I'm like, why didn't you do that in college? Like I did that in college. Like that's real life. Like that's messy. Life is messy. Life is vulnerable. And so I think that like she has my anxiety, although there are some parts that are more exaggerated for the book than experiences that I've had. Like I think she ruminates more than I do. Or I think I ruminate, but I was talking to my sibling about this because they ruminate. And they ruminate and kind of get stuck on it. I ruminate and then write about it. And that's been a real release for me. Like I'll think about something I was thinking a few months ago about gender and career and sexual assault, and I just kept ruminating on it, and then I was like, I'm going to write about this. So then I ruminate, how am I going to write about this, how am I going to write about this, and then I write about it, and then I realize I can let it go. So a lot of people who ruminate, I think, don't have a release at the end, and so Margot doesn't have a release. She just ruminates. Thankfully, I have figured out what that release can be for me, or at least one of them. So some of it's exaggerated. And I do think that I've had so many people tell me that they see themselves in Margot, which is really interesting because to me, Margot is kind of niche. She's quirky. She's confident about who she is while also being like cripplingly socially awkward and have a sense of self, but also not knowing who she is. And I think that that's real life. I think that that's college for like most people, right? Or young adulthood. And so I think it's really pleased me to see how much her contradictions and her like messiness and the nuances of that character resonate with people, because I was also told not to write a character that nuanced. And I'm like, no, but this is how people are. People make weird decisions. People make bad decisions. People make things, like, do things that don't make sense in the context of who you think they are. But that's real life. And so part of writing this book was figuring out that like Margot didn't have to be me. Like she could have elements of who I am. And also some of the other characters have little like personality traits of who I am.
So, how was it to write intimacy and sex scenes? How do you balance like scenes of explicit sexual content with, a sort of sense of reality in the story?
Yeah, I did not intend to write sex scenes. That those were one of the things that just kind of happened, and it was like, this is what the book needs. And when I was originally writing for Kindle Vella, I had a couple of friends like from that community who I was like, hey, I have this sex scene coming up. Like, would you read it and tell me if it's too explicit, if it's like not explicit enough, if it makes you uncomfortable in any way, like if so, why? Or like, is this the level of spice that you like? And what was so fascinating to me was that like half of the feedback that I got was that it wasn't explicit enough. There needed to be like more body parts, more fluids, more thrusting, all that kind of stuff. And then the other feedback that I got was that it was too explicit, and that like I shouldn't use the word penis or vagina or clitoris, and that like I should use euphemisms for everything, like a lot of romance writers do. And so I thought, okay, well, if I'm getting two exactly opposite pieces of feedback, I think I'm in the right place. Like, I think that this feels authentic to what sexual experiences feel like.
So I think there's a good question to ask here then, for any of our listeners who, because I think everyone's got a story in them, don't they say? Everyone's got a story in them. I think for anyone who's curious about that process, and like I said, I myself would like to publish something at some point in the future. What would you say is like, what are the main things people need to know when it comes to traditional publishing versus self-publishing?
So I think there's two things that I would say. The first one is that if you're writing for traditional publishing, unfortunately, you basically need to write in one genre and you need to have tropes. Even though my story started out with genre and with tropes, it didn't end up that way. And that actually made it really hard to pitch to people because most commercially successful books are in a genre. So romance or YA or coming of age. But my story was like a kind of lit fic, kind of upmarket, kind of contemporary with a romantic subplot, but not technically a romance. And that people don't like that. People don't like that nuance. And I think that that's just a function of like how our media works, how book marketing works. So like I actually love that nuance and that's what I look for in books, but that means I'm not usually reading the ones that are like mass produced. I'm usually looking for indie authors. So if your whole goal is to like get representation, get an agent, or get a direct publishing deal with a publishing house, it probably will be easier if you're writing in one specific genre and you're utilizing those tropes, because then you can talk about those tropes in your query letter and you can talk about the genre in the query letter. When I realized how nuanced my book was and that it was cross genre, I was able to update my query to really reflect that. And I think that I got a lot of really positive feedback. Like if this hadn't been published on Kindle Velo, we could have a conversation about it, but I can't. I also got several offers for publication, but with publishing houses, because again, those agents really need that genre to be able to then pitch you to the publishing houses. So if you're writing cross genre, it might work better to go directly to publishing houses, these smaller publishing houses, rather than trying to get an agent and get like a huge, deal. Because like there aren't a lot of huge deals to be had right now. Like selling books is hard, whether you're a traditional publisher or whether you're a self-published author. And so I would say that's one thing to think about. And I'm actually so glad I didn't know this at the beginning of my journey, because I might have changed my story and stuck with one genre and used those tropes. But I'm so happy with the way that the story ended up, not knowing that I was supposed to do that. And so I've been thinking about it for my second book, like how much do I want to play into that? Can I still write this kind of nuance and have somebody an agent want to take me on, or have a publishing house want to take this on? But the second thing is that if you are going with an agent or a publishing house, and if you're going to query that way, you need to really, really read the contracts that you are sent. Because a lot of times people think that any contract is going to be better than self-publishing. But I think I had three offers and I read 3 different contracts, and they were all really bad for me in different ways. One of them was just not very specific about the revenue. One was not specific about what the company's responsibilities would be for like the cover and the editing and things like that. Then another one was just like not specific about anything. I'm like, I can't sign this. My husband's a lawyer, so like I actually have read a lot of contracts and I know quite a bit more about contract law than the average person. But there's a really great website called Writer Beware that you can read. They have like these blog posts of red flags for contracts. So what I actually did is I went to that website and I read all of the articles that they had about red flags for contracts. And then I actually made a Word document. Here are all the different red flags. Here are all the things that I have to look for. And so when I went and evaluated the contracts in that context, I was like, none of these contracts work for me. And 2 of them were so bad that I just said no. And one of them I sent back comments and I was like, so this doesn't make sense. If we can clarify this, I'm like really excited to have another conversation. And I never heard back, which is apparently really common. Like people don't want their contracts to be questioned, and knowing a little bit about contracts, if their contract is vague, it's because it benefits that other person. And so I know this, that like you can't, if somebody says, oh, well, that's what the contract says, but actually our plan is to do this, you cannot trust that. You have to look at what the actual contract says, because the only thing they're contractually obligated to do is what's in the contract. So if you want ultimate control over your editing process or the cover, or if you don't want to wait 2 years to publication, or you don't want to sign a vague contract, it's possible that self-publishing might be right for you. And especially because in this day and age, authors actually have to do a lot of their own marketing anyway. A lot of like going to events and using social media and blog posts and things like that. You would have to do that whether you self-publish or whether you traditionally publish. So there's a lot of overlap in the amount of work that you need to do. So whether you go with a publishing house or get an agent really just has to do with like, what's your ultimate goal? Is your ultimate goal to get like on the New York bestseller list? Because that's not going to be an self-published indie book. Or is your goal to just get this out to as many people as possible, work with your libraries, things like that? You really have to think about your goals and also how much work you're willing to put into things like querying and changing your story to try and match those commercial genres.
Mm. Now, listen, we love to ask this question to some of our guests, and it's a little three-parter. I need to know from you, Luna, my love, what food gives you life? What food brings you peace? And since you're a coffee lover, what is your coffee order?
Okay, I'm going to cheat here and say coffee for all of them because coffee is like my favorite thing in the whole world next to bread. But I'm supposed to be gluten-free, so I can't eat bread. So coffee is the one thing that I can like regularly consume that just makes me really happy. It's so comforting to me. Like I wake up in the morning and I make a cup of coffee. Right now I'm using this like Chobani pumpkin creamer that's like oddly the creamiest thing like I have ever tasted. I'm not even like a pumpkin spice bitch. Like that's not my thing, but it's so good. It's like really subtle. And so that's what I drink at home. And I drink about 3 cups of coffee a day, but I have to finish by like 11:45 or I will not sleep at night. So I'm like packing them in the morning. So I have 3 cups of coffee in the morning and it's such a part of my routine. And also that comfort of just like that warm drink that you can just sort of sit with. I like sitting with things. I like sitting with books. I like sitting with art. I like sitting with coffee. So like, or I love, walking with a coffee and sitting in a park with a coffee and people watching with a coffee. So I feel like coffee is kind of like my best friend. It comes with me everywhere as long as it's before 11:45 in the morning. But when I actually go out to a coffee shop, I am a really frugal person. So I tend to just get like the cheapest thing on the menu. So I'm like an Americano or drip kind of person. But my favorite thing in the whole world is, well, 2 things. One, an oat milk latte with homemade vanilla syrup. My favorite. I love it. But also in the book, it comes up a lot how Margot loves Scottish cappuccinos because there's genuinely something really different about Scottish milk and it foams up to like this thick, like creamy, almost like pudding. And it's like unlike anything else. And my kids and I went to Scotland last spring, and I hadn't been back in like 18 years. And like the first thing we did was all get cappuccinos and little spoons so that we could like spoon the cappuccinos like Margot does in the book. So coffee is a big part of my life and also a huge part of my travel experiences. Like it's something I love doing. I love getting different kinds of coffee in different places, and I feel like it's kind of a way to explore the world.
So, what do you feel our listeners can take away from today's conversation?
I hope that your listeners can take away from today's conversation is that everyone has a voice. It's just, can you find a way to express it, whether that's through art or writing or talking to people? And can you give yourself the permission to use it? Because I think for me, for a long time, I had very like clear experiences and things that I wish that I could have talked about. But until I learned more about the way international is a cult, I didn't have like the language to talk about it. But having that exposure really allowed me to come into my own with my own voice and say like, even if this helps one person, I'm still going to say it because nobody should be put in a situation where they're raised in a religious restrictive environment and not really have a way out. Like that sucks for absolutely anybody that's involved. So even if what I say can help even one person, I'm going to say it. And I've had a lot of people tell me that my writing on my religious childhood has really helped them like learn that they were in a cult or learn that they were in strict religious organization, a controlling organization, or that it just helped them heal. And that is amazing. And I don't think I'm like the best writer in the world, but I'm willing to sit down and put my work out there. And I hope that that frees someone else to heal or to create. I think that a lot of creativity is just letting go of your own expectations for yourself. And also advocacy is the kind of the same way. Like it's hard to be an advocate and be like self-conscious all the time. So whatever you're passionate about, whether it's about like body positivity, body neutrality, kink, the environment, politics, whatever it is, if you're constantly self-conscious all the time, it's really hard to be an advocate. So I would encourage people to kind of let go of the expectations that other people have of them. A friend of mine told me a few years ago, and it just sticks in my head, like what other people think about you is none of your business. And I swear, if I could just infuse that into like everybody's coffee this morning so that they can consume it and just like run with it, I wish that they would, because our lives are so much richer when the people around us are allowed to be who they are. And that includes you. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. They want other people around them to be authentic, but then they don't allow themselves that, whether it's through like the way that they dress or the expectations as a parent or where they think they should go on vacation. There's so many different ways that we essentially shut ourselves off. And so I would just encourage people to be honest with yourself about what you need and what you would like to say to the world. And then let yourself find time for that and prioritize that, whatever it is, whether it's creating or whether it's a different way of parenting or whether it's finding a new relationship or ending an old relationship. Like if we can be who we are, that gives permission to other people to figure out who they are and free themselves from whatever expectations they have. And so I just hope that this helps just like even one person realize that there's something more for them that they want, and also that they can work to get to it. It's not always easy. It's not like, oh, I'm queer, I suddenly have that all figured out. Well, I've been in a relationship with a man for 22 years. What am I supposed to do? I can't just like magically, I mean, I could just like get a divorce and, move away from my kids and like figure out my sexuality. Or I can be like, this is a process. This is going to take a while. Like, I think that we need to understand that sometimes it takes a while to get to where we want to go and to who we want to be. But you have to take that first step of letting go of other people's expectations for you.
Mm. I think this is a good time to remind everyone, the person who we're speaking with today, Luna Westish, you've clearly experienced several lifetimes worth of things in your lifespan, and all of that feeds through to your experiences, your understanding, your writing, and the person that you are today. And I think for our listeners, it's good to remind ourselves that we are similarly all made of the same stuff. We are all of us a compilation of our experiences, our traumas, but also our victories and our beliefs and everything that we do. And, much like in a gaining journey where the true success just comes from making little changes every day to be the person who you want to be, so too with art, right? It comes down to making little changes, little processes, little things that help you to move forward in a life that is very full and seems to demand a lot of all of us, whether that's our trauma or the expectations that are placed on us. We can still find opportunity to do all the things we want to do. Maybe not as fast or as instant or as complete as we maybe had in mind, but still with some sense of adulthood success. As much as the world is a wild place, especially these days, there is plenty of opportunity for brilliance and for shine. And I think, Luna, you exemplify all of that, to which I want to say thank you so much for bringing all of your wonderful self here to chat with us today. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast.
Now, where can our listeners find you and the book online?
So you can find Meet Me at the Ruins everywhere books are sold. So you can actually go into your local bookstore and almost certainly they can order it for you. You can also order it on bookshop.org. If you Google bookshop.org Luna Westish, you'll actually get to my shop and you can purchase the book through there. And I mention that because authors actually make a lot more money when you buy books on Amazon, which sucks. I would much rather make more money in other places. So I set up this bookshop.org like storefront because then I get a little kickback when you buy my book through me. So then I actually make almost as much through bookshop.org than I do through Amazon. So you can buy it anywhere you want to, obviously, but that's a little way to make sure that the author is getting as much as possible. If they have a bookshop.org storefront, use that to buy their own book. You can also get it on Hoopla and Libby. So Hoopla, I think from like all libraries, I think is how it works. And then through Libby, you can request it from your library. And I'm a huge library person. So that is like a huge milestone to me that people can read it, the ebook on their phone or tablet. And yeah, you can get it pretty much anywhere. Apple Books, Google Books, I think pretty much anywhere. And then the goal is to have an audiobook. I know for me, it's an accessibility issue. I love listening to audiobooks, but also oftentimes they work better for, some people with chronic illness and stuff. So it's a big goal, but it's also a big project. So at some point, maybe early 2026, the audiobook should be ready as well.
Fantastic. And just quickly, if people wanted to follow along with you and your author journey, where can they find you online?
Yes, I have a website. It's lunawestish.wordpress.com. I do little blog posts about my writing journey, publishing journey, things like that. I also am on Instagram and Facebook as Luna Westish. I'm also on TikTok as Luna Westish, and I think BlueSky. But yeah, Instagram and TikTok are the two that I'm the most active on, and I hate all of it. I hate all of social media right now, but at the same time, it's a wonderful way to connect to people, and there's some lovely community to be found there. So feel free to find me there and connect. And I do genuinely love meeting people through social media.
Wonderful. Well, listen, y'all, that is it for another week here on Thicc Radio. Please remember to like and subscribe, rate us 5 stars, and leave us a good review. Now, if you liked this episode, the podcast, our guest, and their work, or just us in general, please share it with your friends and encourage them to tune in. You can find me on Instagram and BlueSky at stannnum.
And you can find me on Instagram at ThiccyMouse and Grommr at Orpheus. You can also find us on Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at Thicc Radio, or visit our website at podpage.com/ThiccRadio. If you'd like to become a financial supporter of the show, you can donate through our PayPal, and you can always email us at thiccradio@gmail.com. So until next time, bye, Fats.
Bye, Fats.
Bye, Bets.
Let's talk about it.
Thicc Radio is a Spotify podcast
Artwork, media design, editing, and production by James Heinzen.
with original theme music by CYMK.